I have been working through the Old Testament, doing a survey of the Hebrew scriptures, and we've worked our way up to Samuel, 1st and 2nd Samuel. And in this video, we'll be focusing on 1st Samuel. But the introduction will apply to both 1st and 2nd Samuel. In terms of the title, the two books are named after Samuel because he is the principal character, and especially when we're looking at 1st Samuel, we could say, even in a sense, the last of the judges, and he is anointed and had a ministry in anointing two of the principal characters of the books of Samuel, that is Saul and David. The name simply means Shemuel. It can mean name of God, and some have suggested from Shema, Shem meaning name, El meaning God, Shema, heard, God has heard, is another possibility for the etymology of the name, hearing the prayer of his mother Hannah. So as we move on, originally the books were regarded as one. The Septuagint named these books, along with the Kings, Bibliobasileon, that is, books of the kingdom, and called 1st and 2nd Samuel and the 1st and 2nd books of the kingdom, and the books of Kings, the 3rd and 4th books of the kingdom. The Vulgate, that is the Latin translation, altered the title to Libre Regum, that is the books of the kings. The division of the books seems to have been introduced in the Hebrew Bible by Daniel Bomberg in 1517. The title then was taken from the Hebrew manuscripts and retained in the English version. The Authorized Version adds the title, otherwise called the first book of the Kings and the 2nd book of the Kings. In terms of authorship, Jewish tradition, according to Baba Batra in the Talmud, maintains that Samuel wrote the books which bear his name, as well as the books of Judges and Ruth. This, however, was objected at an early date, this position, and it seems unlikely that Samuel wrote both books, since much that is found in them, that is in 1st and 2nd Samuel, is after the death of Samuel. So the authorship of the books cannot truly be dogmatically stated. But the following facts are significant. Number one, the statement of 1 Samuel 27:6, wherefore Ziklag pertains unto the kings of Judah unto this day, need not refer to a date after the separation of the northern kingdom, since a distinction between Judah and Israel is seen also in David's time in 1 Samuel, for example, 18 verse 6, or 2 Samuel 2 verse 10. The expression unto this day then also need not be dated after the time of David. Since David's death is not recorded, it is probable, especially in 2 Samuel, it is probable that the books were written prior to his death. Therefore, it is most probable, it seems, that the books were composed before David's death by a prophet who made use of earlier documents left by Samuel and Nathan, 1 Chronicles 29:29, And this seems to suit the purpose and theme of what's going on in the books. As to the date, again, the date of writing is after the death of Samuel. We know this from 1 Samuel 25:1, and seems to be before the death of David, since there is no record of his death. Hence, if we were going to date the book, the early part of 1 Samuel may have been written about 1000 BC, and the rest some 30 or 50 years thereafter. In terms of historical background, during the period of Israel's history, the larger countries of Egypt and Assyria were not strong. Internal strife was plaguing Egypt, and Assyria was constantly threatened by outside attacks. Because there was no interference from these larger countries at the time, Israel then was able to develop into a powerful monarchy during this period. Israel, instead then of facing these larger powers, confronted a number of smaller nations such as Philistia, the Syrians, the Ammonites, the Edomites, the Moabites, and the Amalekites. Perhaps the most troublesome kingdom of Israel, or for Israel, during this period was that of Philistia. Philistia had 5 cities that were her strongholds: Ashkelon, Ashdod, Ekron, Gaza, and Gath. Hence, whenever a military objective was involved, these could unite and become a serious threat to Israel. Due to their possession of iron, the Philistines were strong then during the days of Samuel and Saul. It was not until the time of David then that their power was subdued. As to the purpose of the books, the purpose of the books of Samuel is to relate the setting up of the monarchy. Samuel was both a judge and a prophet, and literally connects the period of the judges with the early monarchy. The personal history of Samuel is traced alongside of the moral failure of the priesthood under Eli and his sons. Also, with the history of Samuel, the rise of the prophetic office is described, in which which we see the schools of the prophets described. For example, in 1 Samuel 19, verse 20. Following his history, the books treat then the establishment of the king of Israel over the land. The Israelites, desiring a king as the other nations, approached Samuel concerning it, and Saul then is hence appointed as their king. Being a self-willed autocrat, his failure was soon apparent, and in his place, a man after God's heart, that is David, was anointed as their king. He pointed forward then to the great king to come, and that is Jesus Christ, who would reign in absolute righteousness. It is interesting, even in a book like Ezekiel, it talks about when Messiah comes, using the name David or David. And when we look at the book of Matthew, we're going to see David all over the genealogy of Matthew chapter 1. And we'll talk about that at the end. As we go on, furthermore, with David's reign, the establishment of Israel's political center in Jerusalem, we see this in 2 Samuel 5 in particular, was carried out, and her religious center in Zion in 2 Samuel again 5 verse 7. We see also the Davidic covenant that one would reign on David's throne forever in 2 Samuel 7. All are recorded and become the basis of a future kingdom fulfilled in terms of New Testament teaching and theology in Jesus Christ. Thus, the books of Samuel trace the history of Samuel, Saul, and David, these three personages, in recounting the establishment of the monarchy and pointing out the divine origin of this institution. In terms of the flow of thought of the book, or the overall content of 1 Samuel, the theme of the book of 1 Samuel is the history of Israel from the birth of Samuel to the death of Saul. In 1 Samuel, there are three basic developments or movements. There is the rule of Samuel, first of all, in 1 through chapter 7. Secondly, this is followed by the reign of Saul, 8 through 15:35, or through chapter 15. And then the book culminates in the rise of David, 16 through 31. As we begin to track the content and the overall flow of thought, the first section, developing the rule of Samuel in chapter 1, begins with his birth. Samuel's mother, Hannah, is very sorrowful that she does not have a child and prays to the Lord, vowing to consecrate the child to the Lord. This is all in chapter 1. The Lord answers Hannah's prayer, and the child is named Samuel, as a token of the Lord's faithfulness in answering her prayer. This is where Shema would fit well, and El has heard. She praises the Lord for his power and kindness in meeting her request, and dedicates him to the Lord in fulfillment of her vow. The environment of Samuel, though, is not the best, as he is reared among the disconcern of Eli and the immorality and flagrant wickedness of his sons, Hophni and Phinehas. This is in chapter 2. Out of the midst of this dismal environment, however, the Lord is to call his messenger Shemuel, called by God to be his judge and prophet, and is supplied then with the necessary grace and power to carry out the Lord's purpose. His first message after his call is not an easy one, as he must tell Eli the doom that awaits his family in chapter 3. Following the message, the writer of 1 Samuel says, quote, "And Samuel grew, and the Lord was with him, and did not let any of his words fall to the ground. And all Israel, from Dan to Beersheba, knew that Samuel was established to be a prophet of the Lord." This is in chapter 3. The ministry of Samuel then follows. This is in chapters 4 through 7. During his life and ministry, the Philistines plague Israel, capturing the Ark of the Covenant from them and defeating them. Thousands are slain, including the sons of Eli. The glory, Ichabod, the glory leaves her, that is Israel, as indicated by the name that Phinehas's widow gives to her newborn son. While the Philistines deal a blow to Israel, the God of Israel brings his power and glory to bear through the ark. The ark then brings disaster among the Philistines. We see that in chapter 5. Placed in the temple of Dagon, the grain god of the Philistines, the Philistine god Dagon is found fallen to the ground on the first morning. The second morning, the idol is shattered. This is followed by an epidemic then of tumors among the Philistines. The ark travels from Ashdod to Gath and finally to Ekron, carrying judgment as it goes. So the Lord's carrying out his own judgment here in the ark. Since presence of the ark is no longer bearable by the Philistines, it passes on, or they return it to Beth Shemesh in chapter 6. And finally, it passes to Kirjath Jearim in chapter 6 to 7:1. After the return of the ark, then, Samuel delivers a stirring message to the people to turn from idols and to serve the Lord in chapter 7. The children of Israel respond, and the Philistines are defeated by them. The name of the place of victory is called Ebenezer, that is, stone of help. The Lord has helped them and brought deliverance. Furthermore, the second development then of the book begins with the reign of Saul in chapters 8 to 15. Due to the age of Samuel, the unfitness of his sons, and the desire to be like other nations, Israel demands a king. Against the warning of Samuel and the perfect will of God, the Lord then permits the people to have their king, and Samuel is told to hearken unto their request. Saul, searching for his father's asses, meets Samuel in chapter 9 and is privately anointed by him and then publicly installed at Mizpah. This is in chapter 10. Samuel's choice then is vindicated when Saul defeats the Ammonites and delivers Jabesh Gilead in chapter 11. This ratification is then followed by Samuel's speech in which he reminds the people of the Lord's righteous deeds and their sin again in asking for a king. Following this, the rule of Saul is only a demonstration of the mistake Israel has made in choosing a king and rejecting the theocracy, that is the rule of God. Saul makes three grave mistakes that leads to God's rejection of him as Israel's king. He first of all intrudes into the office of the priesthood, and because of his irreverent presumption, God is saying in this text, Saul is not a good king. He next gives a rash vow to fast, which almost cost the death of his son, Jonathan, in chapter 14. Jonathan's life, however, is spared as the people protect him. The third sin of Saul was his disobedience to God concerning Agag. Having been told to judge all of the Amalekites, Saul spares their king Agag and the best of their flock and herds in chapter 15. Agag then is finally executed, and Samuel separates from Saul at this point. So notice three mistakes that Saul makes that Samuel, the book of Samuel, details. The third, then, and final main section of the book takes the rise of David and shows his rise to power. God commissioned Samuel to go to the house of Jesse, and as he goes to the house of Jesse, this is where he will meet David. This is at Bethlehem, and he's going to anoint one of Jesse's sons who would be Israel's future king. The most unlikely one to be anointed was David. Samuel comes to Bethlehem, chooses David, and consequently consecrates him as the future king. This is in chapter 16. Following this, then, comes the appointment of David to the court. Perhaps no greater event does more to exalt David in the eyes of Israel than his conflict with Goliath. This is in 17. After his defeat of the Philistine giant, then, David is honored as a hero. As the women praise the exploits of David more than Saul, Saul becomes insanely jealous of David and seeks to destroy him. He seeks to do this, first of all, with a javelin, which he throws at David in chapter 18. He tries to get his daughter to marry and betray David. And then, this is in 18, he asks Jonathan and his servants to get rid of David in 19. And he again uses the spear against him, but fails to kill David. Finally, Michal intervenes to help David escape from the hand of her father. And this is all told in chapter 19. The exile, then, of David from Saul follows in 19 through 30. Jonathan is the first to inform David of his father's continued attitude of anger toward him and promises to protect him. Jonathan and David had a good friendship. David therefore begins his wanderings. His wanderings take him to Nob, where David eats showbread, and from there to Gath, and then to the cave of Adullam, then to Moab, to Judah, and Keilah. This is in 22 and 23 of 1 Samuel chapters. There David is used really to rescue Keilah from the Philistines. From Keilah, David goes to the wilderness of Ziph, where Jonathan visits him and renews their covenant in 23. From there to Maon and to En-Gedi, where David graciously spares Saul's life. He'll do this twice. Although momentarily broken, Saul was essentially, though, unrepentant, and the pursuit continues. Paran is David's next destination, and here he obtains Abigail for his wife after Nabal senselessly refuses David and is judged by God in 25. From Paran, David goes to the wilderness of Ziph, where he again spares the life of Saul. This is in 26. David finally goes to Ziklag, where David gets asylum from the Philistine king of Gath. Discouragement and unbelief caused the Lord's anointed to go over to the Philistines, the enemies of God's people. However, in the meantime, Saul is facing a Philistine advancement. Threatened by defeat, Saul in fear seeks to get in touch with Samuel through the witch of Endor, in chapter 28. God calls Samuel's spirit back, and doom is pronounced on Saul. Following this announcement, Saul then takes food and prepares for the battle with the Philistines. As the Philistines are marching to battle against Israel, the commanders of the Philistines object to David's presence. David then is forced to leave the Philistines and turns back. By God's grace, then, he is saved from fighting against Israel. On his return, David finds that Ziklag has been sacked by the Amalekites through the help of an Egyptian slave of the Amalekite, who is an Amalekite. David is able to overtake the raiders and recover his wives and goods in chapter 30. He restores peace and returns the battle spoil to his people. The book of 1 Samuel then concludes with the death and burial of Saul. This is in 1 Samuel 31. Battling the Philistines at Mount Gilboa, Saul's older sons are killed and he himself is wounded. Facing captivity, he asks his armor bearer to kill him. Refusing Saul's request, Saul falls upon his own sword. His body is dishonored then by the Philistines on the walls of Bethshan, but the men of Jabesh Gilead later recover them by night and bury the remains in Jabesh. So 1 Samuel presents a history then of Samuel, first of all, and his, can we say, background and rule in chapters 1 to 7. Then there is the coronation and reign of Saul and his serious mistakes in chapters 8 and to 15. And then after Saul, we see the rise of David in chapter 16 through chapter 31. That would be a brief overall outline of the book of 1 Samuel. When we think about Christology in the New Testament, I believe that one of the main themes is that David becomes a type of the final David, Jesus Christ. And we'll see that as we come into the New Testament, and especially as we come into the book of Matthew. In the book of Ezekiel talks about how David would come someday. Not literal David, but I believe the name represented by Christ as the Messiah, as the Messiah. It is interesting, in Matthew chapter 1, the word 14 keeps reappearing in the genealogy. For example, it starts out from Abraham to David, from David to the Babylonian captivity, from the Babylonian captivity to Christ. 3, can I say, segments of 14 generations. It is interesting, the name David is 14 in Hebrew. For example, in Hebrew, if we were going to count Aleph, Beit, Gimel, Dalet, Dalet is 4. Now, follow with me. Aleph, Beit, Gimel, Dalet, Hey, Vav, Vav is 6. So if you take Dalet plus Vav plus Dalet, 4 plus 6 plus 4, we end up with 14. And so many have suggested that Matthew might be using a gematria, that is numbers, and especially the number 14 with a threefold witness, genealogical witness, of Christ being the final David. So it is interesting, the book of 1 Samuel then shows both failure of Saul and David then, and his, can I say, coronation, and what will happen then in 2 Samuel will continue the Davidic narrative.